Welcome to Go Solo Live.
Don't you mean go solo live? Have you ever been asked why on earth would you travel alone? Go Solo Live not only answers that question, but celebrates life as a midlife solo traveler. This is a safe place for women to come together to reminisce about their travels, encourage others to travel, and to dig into the real lessons learned from these journeys. Now join Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel as she and her guests share stories of the solo travelers of midlife women.
Hello, sisters, and welcome to Go Solo Live. This is Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel. Time to sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy my conversation with Lisa Marquardt, otherwise known as the Hot Flashpacker, as she shares her stories about her travels around the world. Joining me today is Lisa Marquardt, otherwise known as the Hot Flashpacker. Welcome, Lisa.
Hello.
Great to have you here today. And of course, we first have to start with the story of what is a flashpacker? And I know you describe it on your website, which is what made me learn about it, but I'll tell you in a moment what I thought it was. So tell us, what's a flashpacker?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so flashpacker is a term it's been out there a while, probably a good 10 years or so. Honestly, when I started my website, thought more people knew what it was, but apparently not. I've discovered that since. But flashpacker is a backpacker that combination of things, maybe spends a little money here and there more than the typical backpacker. So a backpacker I think of as like just pinching pennies all the time and staying in the cheapest places and taking the cheapest bus they can. So I upgrade a bit, and then also having more of the technology. So that's what a flashpacker is.
Okay, so my specialty is working with women of midlife. And so when I saw it called the Hot Flashpacker, I thought, a woman of midlife who's starting to have hot flashes, and she added packer at the end. And that's a really clever name. I was wrong.
Well, that's what's so great about the name. It could mean multiple things. So, and I did that on purpose, right? So it's the Hot Flashpacker. So it could be the Hot Flashpacker, or it could be the Hot Flashpacker, or So I thought it was kind of funny. It has really like three different meanings, but yes, I meant it to be a kind of a combination of a couple of those, which is somebody in her middle ages that maybe will be going through hot flashes soon and continuing to travel through my middle ages.
I love it. I love the clever play on words. That's actually what we've done with Go Solo with the podcast, where on one hand it's Go Solo Live, like it's a live recording. On the other hand, it's Go Solo Live, because I truly feel like living is growth exponential when you've traveled solo. Well, I would love to hear a little bit about some of your favorite places and how you started traveling solo. Can you share?
Sure. Probably say I always was into travel. Growing up, my parents we didn't have a lot of money, so we'd take off in the car and drive to our aunt and uncles in Colorado, and we'd stay in Motel 6s and have bologna sandwiches every day for lunch. That was our way of traveling when we were young. In college, I got to go to Europe, so that was my first international trip. Loved it. Continued going to Europe throughout my 20s. And then late in my 20s, I was kind of getting restless in my job, and I started looking online, and this was about 15 years ago. I discovered people who were doing these round the world trips, right? They were quitting their jobs, taking these gap years, taking extended times to travel, and it started to fascinate me. So I researched and discovered, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to buy a round the world airplane ticket, and I'm going to go to what amounted to 6 continents and quit my job, sold my car, sold my house, and bought a backpack. And this was my first real adventurous trip. So on that trip, I did Ireland, almost 4 months in Africa, almost 4 months in South America, a month in New Zealand, a month in Australia, and a couple months in Asia. I came back to the States for my brother's wedding and didn't really feel like working yet, so I decided to set out again, and I headed down to Ecuador and taught English for 7 months, and then came back and started my career again. But even though I've been back in my career for the last 12 years, I still maximize my time off. So I've taken several trips of a month. A few years back, I took some unpaid leave, and I ended up going on the Silk Road for 3 months. And then more recently, I took a pay cut in my job. And so now, just don't fall out of your chair. I have about 100 days off of work this year as a result of taking a pay cut. So I'm doing some van camping. I'll do an international trip later this year. But yeah, last year I went on 2 trips for 7 weeks each.
Okay, so you have just piled on a whole plethora that we're going to start to figuratively unpack. And let's start with, what was the trigger for making the decision? I mean, this is a big decision, quitting your job, making the plunge to actually buy the round the world ticket. By the way, for those of you who aren't familiar, there actually are such things as round the world tickets. And we could spend a whole lot of time talking about the ins and outs of that. But really, I want to know what made you choose that was the time and the way, and especially since you said that was your first real big adventure.
Yeah, I think it was just, I had spent 8 years at my first job. I was definitely having some dissatisfaction about it. I had finished a very difficult professional designation a couple years earlier, and I had spent a lot of my 20s studying and doing that. The friends that I had, a lot of them were getting married off. I was not. So it was, I think, a culmination of those things with my job and my personal life that I just decided I want to do this adventuring when I'm young. And obviously now I'm getting older and I'm still wanting to do this adventuring, but that was probably the basis of the decision for the first big trip.
How much time had you spent planning? Because a lot of people, get to this, it's cool and it's something that many people say, I quit my job, I traveled around the world, but it's never really quite that simple.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that you did in preparation?
Yeah, I did a lot of planning, and in hindsight, I wish I did less because my best times, honestly, were the ones that were unplanned. So just to kind of give you an overview here, I went to Ireland. That was pretty easygoing. It was my first time really staying in hostels. I hadn't really stayed in hostels at all in my 20s. So here I am at third one, first time in a hostel. That went pretty well. I took public buses. I hitchhiked, a couple times because I needed to, but that was just sort of to ease myself into it. And then I flew to Africa. There I did something called an overland tour. It was 10 weeks with, it's one truck and a driver and a guide/host. And you participate, you have to set up your tent. Every 6 days you're in the cook group, so you have to go buy the things in the market and cook for the group. But you drive from place to place and you go on safari for a day or two, then you go over to Zanzibar for 4 days. So there's all these activities you can do along the way that are optional. And that's a really great way to do Africa on what is a pretty low budget, is about as low as you can go without doing it on your own and with buses. So that was a good introduction to Africa. I did also like a hop-on, hop-off bus that goes to all the hostels in South Africa.
Wow, that's fantastic.
So these were kind of the planned parts. So I was going to do another 105-day overland trip in South America. And halfway through Africa, there was one person who was getting on my nerves. And I'm like, man, I cannot spend 105 days with another person like this. And so I actually canceled that tour. Wow. So now all I had was a flight into South America, into Ecuador. I knew no Spanish. I was supposed to be on this tour, but now it's canceled. And that was probably like the most life-changing thing, because here I am in a country, don't speak the language, and didn't literally even have a single reservation, a single plan. And that's where I kind of first got into sometimes not having a plan is better than having a plan, because I had the greatest adventures when I didn't have a plan.
I think that speaks volumes, and I want people to really hear it. There's nothing wrong with planning, but it's also so important to leave space for the unplanned, and space, like literally the time and the schedule, but also the space and grace to just say, I'm going to change my plans. Things are different than what I expected they would be. And I'm okay with living in the moment, which is what you
Yep.
did when you decided you couldn't travel with that person.
Yeah. Can I share one more example of something I just did last year when I didn't have a plan?
You bet.
This was a 7-week trip last year, and I flew into and out of Bali, but I knew I wanted to get further east to some of the islands that are less visited. So I headed over to Flores, did that on my own, and then headed over to Timor and did that on my own, and then took a bus over to Timor-Leste, which formerly was called East Timor. And I didn't realize it at the time. There are just not really tourists in East Timor. It doesn't really have an infrastructure for that. And once again, I had planned ahead and thought, oh, I really want to go to this island off the East Coast. It's called Jacko Island. And there was one company offering a tour, but it was ridiculous. It was like $900 for a 3-day trip, something like that.
Oh, my.
So I just was like, okay, well, I'm going to go. If there's an opportunity to go to Jacko Island, I will go. Otherwise, this is this other island that's simpler to get to from the capital. So I'll just go and see what happens. And my first night there, I went to stay in the one hostel and got to talking with some people. And somebody mentioned, oh, this other person kind of wants to go to Jacko. She'd be interested. Why don't you talk to her? So we met up that evening and said, well, actually, it was the next day. The next day, we met up and said, yeah, I guess let's go. So at 3:00 in the afternoon, we headed over to the bus station and just had the most amazing 5.5-day experience that involved like some guy taking her bag. And it didn't really take her bag, but he sort of did. We rode in a vehicle that had a dowry goat. So it was a goat that was tied up riding in this little minivan with us, going to be given as a dowry for a wedding.
Oh, wow.
We stayed with the nuns. We hitchhiked. Oh, yeah, we got invited to the cockfight. So we went to cockfighting one night. And it was just like everything crazy happened on this 5.5-day trip. But it was not at all planned, but was by far the biggest highlight of that entire trip.
That sounds fantastic. And once again, you just went with opportunity as it presented itself. I think that makes such a difference. And being able to see that opportunity and just choose it.
Yeah. And we didn't see another tourist. We saw 3 tourists at the island itself, but didn't see any other tourists for the entire trip. And they were on a, private 4x4 trip from the capital that I'm sure cost in the thousands of dollars. So we were happy to be where we were at.
That's fantastic. Now, you said on this first big trip, you spent 4 months in Africa, and Africa's massive and it's a continent. So what countries were you in, and what were you trying to achieve by that amount of time? It's a significant amount.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier this overland trip. So that was the big chunk of it. That was 10 full weeks. So arrived in Nairobi, headed over to Rwanda to see the gorillas, and then headed south from there. So hit Tanzania, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia. And then we ended in Cape Town. And then from there, I did another, maybe it was closer to 3 months, because, I spent about another 5-6 weeks in South Africa on this hop-on, hop-off hostel bus called Baz bus. There it was more like, I've done on this 10-week thing, we hit all the safaris. I'd seen all of the animals I really wanted to see. So South Africa was more about some of the culture and the just beautiful scenery of the coast. So I spent a lot of time in the area called the Wild Coast, which is kind of the only part of the coast that hasn't been developed up by the interstate highways and cities and such.
That is fantastic. So where else did you go when you did the Around the World trip?
So that one was, I talked about Ireland, Africa, South America. I really just did Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. Kind of got stuck in Ecuador and spent 8 weeks of the 3.5 months I was going to spend there, and just having fun. I made some friends, and I was studying Spanish and doing a little volunteer work. So all of those things culminated, and I just got stuck there and really was enjoying myself. From there, I did just Peru and Bolivia, went over to Easter Island for their annual festival for a couple days.
Wow.
And then New Zealand, Australia, and then Singapore up to Thailand.
You really did make your way around. Now, you said you came back to the States in between. What was that like in terms of culture shock, adjusting? We talk about this idea of reentry, and you were debating maybe about whether you were going to hit the road again.
Yeah. So when I came back for my break in between the traveling, like you said, it was a bit of a culture shock, but not as much as I thought it would be. It was, I came home for my brother's wedding. My parents love to travel, so I actually took them. I hadn't traveled with them for many years, so we actually did the Lewis and Clark Trail by car. And because it was the 200th anniversary, I believe, of that event. So that was a good time to just spend some real quality time with my family. And I was debating, do I start looking for a job right away? And I had a couple friends back and a guy I was interested in Ecuador. So I thought, hey, I'm going to go back there. And I had heard it was pretty easy to get an English teaching job. So I just decided, you know what, I'm going to go back. I hadn't run out of money yet. And Ecuador is incredibly cheap. So I just went back.
Well, and now you have your next trip planned. So that's also one of the things that I start to see when people are bit by the travel bug, which is it becomes something that they're always planning the next trip or the next couple of trips. So you were able to find some work teaching in Ecuador, teaching English, as well as find that it had a really nice, affordable cost of living.
Yeah.
Do you keep going back to the same place?
On that trip, no. You mean in general, do I go back when I travel?
Yeah.
No, I rarely actually go back to a place when I travel so far. There's just so many places to see. I don't know if I have a goal to go to every country in the world, but I do like to see new countries and new places. So Ecuador was actually one of the few places I returned to. In the States, I would say I've been returning to Oregon a lot. I live in the Seattle area, and I love Oregon. There's some really remote, really cool places in Oregon. But other than that, I don't return to a lot of places.
So as you're going back to Ecuador, what are some of the things that you're hoping to do there? And again, it's partly because you're teaching, so work is always a good calling to do in another country. What else do you want to see?
Yeah, nothing really in particular. I thought I would study Spanish and improve my Spanish. That was part of it. The work wasn't for the sake really of working, but more so just to have something to do. So I work part-time. I work 4 hours a day and spent the rest of the day, I'd go out, I'd exercise, I'd go dancing in the night. I did some weekend trips when I had a chance to do that. So I did get to travel around Ecuador a little bit more. I have actually a quite funny story about how I ended up going to the Galapagos for a week for free from an invitation by somebody. And then I also headed down to Buenos Aires and Iguazu Falls for Christmas and New Year's with one of my friends, another expat that was living in Ecuador.
That sounds fantastic.
Yep.
So who are you meeting along the way when you're traveling? I think that's one of the things that people aren't familiar, they're anxious about, will I be very lonely? And you're traveling in some travel groups that allow for connection. But what kinds of people are you meeting as you travel?
Wide variety of people. Definitely probably more Europeans than Americans in the kinds of places that I'm going. Sometimes I meet a few Americans, sometimes I might not see any for days. Generally, when it comes to people traveling by themselves, I find it's more like 80% female and 20% male. There's definitely a lot more women traveling solo around, and then also like as friends. A lot of the guys I meet, many of them are couples, and I think it's the girls that are probably dragging along sometimes too. So, but it's a wide age group, and it really kind of depends on where you're going. So some of the more like really rarely visited places, you might find an older group, and then there's places like Thailand or some of the traditional party places are really more of your 18 to early 20s. And I kind of avoid some of those places on purpose, but I try to find the more off the beaten trail places myself.
That is fantastic. Now, when you're out talking to Americans in some of these destinations, because I know you're running into more Europeans, what is the experience that you're hearing? What's their story related to why they're traveling or why they chose those destinations as you're off the beaten path?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think like some of the people I've met in the last year. I know I met a couple that I ran into several times in Flores Islands in Indonesia. And they were a young couple, probably late 20s, and they had quit their jobs and were traveling around. I'm trying to think. So I was just in Ethiopia and Djibouti and Somaliland just last fall. And I did travel. Actually, I met a guy online on lonelyplanet.com. They have a forum called the Reentry, and you can find travel companions. And so I met a 74-year-old guy from California and a 68-year-old guy from Oslo, Norway. And the three of us traveled together for 6 days to go over to eastern Ethiopia and into Somaliland to share the costs and such. So that guy was real interesting. He's been to almost all of the countries, so just trying to get in the last few. But yeah, there weren't a lot of Americans at all in Ethiopia. We met a number in Djibouti, but a lot of them were working in military jobs there.
So you just shared a great way to connect, though. You said on Lonely Planet they have something called the Thorn Tree.
Yes.
And so you were able to find like-minded people to travel with and share expenses.
Yeah, it's hit or miss sometimes, but I've done now. So there was this one, Somaliland. I also met 2 women that we shared costs in Omo Valley in Ethiopia on the same trip. And I spent 8 days with one of those women. And then the other time I did it was probably about 5 years ago. I met a woman and we traveled the Trans-Siberian, Trans-Mongolian Railway all the way from St. Petersburg to Beijing by train. And her and I got along really, really well. So we're in touch by Facebook, and I've seen her a couple times since that trip. But I highly recommend it. It's kind of hit or miss. You might not find anybody, or you could find like the best companion ever for traveling.
Well, and it's a nice option. Again, there aren't a lot of connection options out there. So especially when you're looking at some of those more unusual destinations.
Yeah.
Have you found other travel companions through other means, or do you generally just make a decision and just go solo?
I also have 2 friends here in the Seattle area that I travel with relatively frequently. I've done a couple trips with them, and sometimes I'll do like part of the trip with one and then part of the trip with another. One is just a guy friend of mine that lives here, and I just met him through friends in town. The other one, actually, that's a funny story. I met her in the Philippines. We realized we were in a van, and we realized we live like 5 miles from each other.
Oh my God.
So it was kind of funny because it was on this bus ride from one town to another, more like a big fancy van ride from one town to another. And I almost got kicked out because I was sitting next to a French woman that had probably never worn deodorant, and she just smelled. And I was trying to crack the window just so I could breathe. And the driver kept on trying to kick me out the whole trip. So I made it to my destination, and we separated, and I didn't ask her information or anything. And then the next day, by luck, we happened to be on the same exact snorkeling trip. So we talked some more and shared details. And her and I now have been to Maldives, Sri Lanka. She also met me in Ethiopia and Djibouti this year for part of that trip as well. So it's all kind of luck who you like to travel with.
That's true. I also think there's something to be said for you're intentionally looking for opportunity to travel with someone, not that you're not completely ruling that out.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a difference.
I do have to add, though, I have had some disastrous trips with other people. Now, sadly, I think I've really hurt 2 pretty good friendships, like people who I was very friendly with in day to day. And then we traveled together and we just were totally different travel style. So actually on my website, I have a questionnaire. It's really funny, but there's like this 20 question questionnaire that's on my website that is, I think if I ever travel with strangers again, I'm going to send the same questionnaire to them because they're really good at matching up. Hey, are you a city person or a country person? And how late do you want to sleep in? And what's your budget? And do you want to do a lot of walking or not a lot of walking? And sort of those kind of questions. You can really find your compatibility. But I don't travel well with people who take a long time to get their makeup done and need to sit down and have this long drawn out breakfast and aren't ready to go till like 1 p.m. in the afternoon. I can't handle that. I got to do stuff.
Okay, I love that because I actually have created a travel compatibility profile. It's probably 5 pages long because it gets into whether you're planning the trip together or things like that. But I will tell you, I've now pulled your questionnaire because I'm very curious. There's something to be said for compatibility and what that can do to the quality of your experience.
Yeah. I was literally crying on my way back from Iceland because I just kind of had a couple miserable days on the end where I wanted to do something and my travel companion didn't want to do that thing and didn't want to separate. So.
Ooh. Yeah. So, I mean, again, that's partly the negotiation that you can do and things like that. It's not perfect. I don't even think if you spent days ahead planning for contingencies, it won't always go perfectly, but setting some sort of expectations, it really does make a difference. And I will say my biggest lesson learned was when I was traveling solo, but a friend joined me for the weekend. And she required the news on every morning, waking up with the news and then going to bed with the news each night. And I take in my news entirely differently. And that wasn't how I do it. Like, we need to compromise. This is not going to work for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, TV is a big one. That one is on my questionnaire. Do you like the TV on all the time, or do you always need the TV off? It's surprising some of the things you don't really think of ahead of time when it can really change your mood between the two.
Yeah. And again, I think there's something to be said for when we're traveling, how much time do you anticipate that we would be spending together? Because I feel like it's okay if we would do stuff apart and not everybody would agree with that.
Yeah, that's happened to me too, for sure.
Very interesting. Well, and I found your questionnaire. I do love it. I think that's very fun.
I've had people tell me it's too much like Sheldon Cooper on the, what's that? I can't even think of the title.
With his roommate agreement?
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't see anything wrong with that. Like, here's the deal. If we both have known factors, we can negotiate those situations. But if things come up that surprise us, in some cases, especially depending on, how passionate someone is, it could certainly change the tone of the trip, lest we say it actually ruins the trip. And people have invested too much time and money and energy and planning. They may never get back to that place. You don't want anybody to leave a trip disenfranchised with the place or the experience or the person.
Yeah, like I said, I feel bad about it, but I really had 2 different friendships on a couple different trips that were, for the most part, ruined because we traveled together. And I don't want to ever go through that again.
Wow. Yep. I think that that's a very good idea. And again, I even think that traveling with friends, we change over time. I used to be the very specific itinerary driven, planning from A to Z. And now I'm much more laissez-faire. But when I've traveled with friends, they're like, wait, don't you have it all planned? Like, no, I don't do that anymore. Well, we need you to do that for us. Yeah. So we got to work on that because that's not what I do.
Yeah.
So we have to allow for people to change and evolve in how they travel or how they want to, experience a place because it can adjust over time.
Yeah.
You said you're headed back to Ecuador. Did you say for 7 months?
Yeah, I taught English the bulk of that 7 months. And then, as I mentioned before, I did some trips, like a couple 1-week trips out of the capital. But it was interesting. I taught at a for-profit school, and granted, this was 13 years ago, but my monthly salary was, I think, $180.
Wow.
So I wasn't doing it for the money.
No.
That actually was enough to pay rent.
That's incredible as well. I mean, like you said, a low cost of living, but that's a very good idea of what low is.
Yes, yeah.
So what's coming next for you, Lisa?
So my car that I was going to drive until it died in January, and I had been seeing vans and watching things about van camping and so forth. So I made the plunge and I bought a van, a Transit Connect. So it's sort of the size of a minivan, but it's a cargo van. So I'm going out on my first sort of cross-country van trip next week, actually. I'm heading across Montana and North Dakota and then visiting some family and then coming back probably through South Dakota and back through Montana. So kind of excited to get out on the road. I took it on a quick little 5-day trip down to Oregon a couple of weeks ago, but the weather was not cooperating very well. So I came home early, but I'm ready to get on this longer trip and hoping we have some good weather.
That sounds great. And so what is your biggest challenge that you think you're going to be facing when you're doing it on the road? It's a different type of experience doing an ongoing road trip.
I think, one might be loneliness. I'm not sure how this will go in the long run, because when I was mentioning traveling in Indonesia, for example, I was totally by myself, but maybe I'd meet somebody and we travel together for a day or 3 days or 5 days. So I keep a lot of the loneliness away that way. But on a van trip, obviously, unless I pick up somebody, one person that's going the same direction, for the most part, I will be alone. So hoping that I can meet some cool people at the campgrounds at least and have some cool people to hang out with in the evening time. But I think that'll be one of the bigger challenges.
Certainly. And as we are almost out of time today, which this time always seems to go so fast, if people are visiting your website at thehotflashpacker.com, what are some of the things that you have out there? I know you have some travel advice. What else do you have out there for people to check out?
I have like a whole bunch of destination guides. So I started blogging about a year ago, but I really didn't start getting more into it until a few months after that. But I have a whole bunch of old content that I just copied and pasted over from something called Travel Pod. It was a free blogging website where you could just put things up for friends and family. And I had taken notes over several trips, so I have a lot of old stuff, but my newer stuff is definitely better quality, better pictures, better descriptions, more helpful for people who are planning for their trips, whereas some of my old stuff is just more like, I woke up at 8:00 and I walked around the city and so it's, I wouldn't say some of my old stuff is my best stuff, but I have some really great guides to especially Ethiopia. I wrote a ton of stuff on my 7 weeks I spent there. So lots of great info on that. Flores Island, Indonesia, Bali, that sort of thing. So, and then we have a couple fun things. Like you said, I have this questionnaire for travel. I have an article on how to save money on a cruise. I've done 3 cruises now, pretty long cruises, and I'm all about saving money. So, there's a big bunch of different things out there.
Fantastic. Well, I definitely appreciate you taking the time to share your stories with us today, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you.
Wasn't it great to hear the stories that Lisa shared with us today? One thing that really stood out for me was about the companionship and compatibility that you have when you're traveling. And whether you look at her questionnaire or ask me for mine, I'm happy to share with you so that you can find the ideal travel companion. Now, if you love these stories and want to help support Go Solo Live, you can do that by making a small financial contribution to the show at patreon.com/Go Solo Live. That's patreon.com/Go Solo Live. Thanks again for showing the love. We've reached the end of another episode, but the conversation doesn't have to end there. Find us on Twitter at Go Solo Live and make sure that you share us with your friends so that they tune in as well. Until next time, remember, go solo, not alone.